Brothers and sisters, many of us carry a quiet confidence that the Spirit of God lives within us, and rightly so. We speak of faith, we confess belief, we gather in worship, and we nod in agreement when truth is preached. Yet there is a painful gap between what we possess and how we live. We have the Spirit, but we often walk as though we do not. We ask for guidance, yet ignore conviction. We pray for strength, yet cling to freedom. We proclaim freedom, yet remain chained to habits, pride, and comfort. The tragedy is not that believers lack power. The tragedy is that we forget to draw from it. The Spirit was not given merely to make us forgiven, but to make us transformed. Not just to prepare us for heaven someday, but to reshape how we speak, decide, love, forgive, and endure today. Too often we live spiritually dehydrated beside an endless river. We rely on our own reasoning instead of divine wisdom. We choose convenience over obedience. We silence the inner nudge because it disrupts our plans. Yet the Spirit speaks, not in thunder, but in truth. Not to flatter us, but to free us. Not to make life easier, but to make us holy. To live by the Spirit is to surrender control. It is to let love replace bitterness, courage replace fear, humility replace pride, and obedience replace excuses. It is to stop asking, "What am I allowed to do?" and start asking, "What is the Spirit calling me to become?" Imagine what would change if believers actually lived as though God's presence was active within them. Our words would heal instead of wound. Our choices would reflect eternity, not impulse. Our faith would be visible, not loud, but powerful. The world does not need more believers who merely possess the Spirit. It needs believers who are led by it. So today, the call is simple but costly. Stop resisting the Spirit you claim to have. Stop compartmentalizing faith to moments and buildings, and start living as though God truly dwells within you, because He does. Possession is not the same as submission. This truth sits at the heart of why many believers struggle to live spiritually vibrant lives. It is entirely possible to have something precious and powerful within your reach and yet never allow it to shape how you live. A person may own a compass and still walk in circles, not because the compass fails, but because it is never consulted. In the same way, many believers sincerely possess the Spirit yet continue to live directed by impulse, fear, habit, or personal preference. Possession speaks of receiving. Submission speaks of yielding. Receiving the Spirit is an act of grace, something given, not earned. Submission, however, is an act of the will. It is the daily, sometimes uncomfortable choice to let divine direction override personal desire. This is where many lives quietly stall. It is easier to celebrate what we have been given than to surrender control over how we live. We rejoice in the gift but resist its authority. The problem is not disbelief. Most believers do not doubt that the Spirit is present within them. The problem is selective obedience. We allow spiritual influence in areas that feel safe, our words in public worship, our moral opinions, our private prayers. Yet we draw firm boundaries around areas we want to manage ourselves. Our anger, our ambition, our grudges, our spending, our relationships, our sense of superiority or self-pity, these remain off limits. We want guidance, but only as long as it does not interfere with our plans. Submission exposes motives. When the Spirit challenges us, it rarely does so loudly. The voice is quiet but persistent, calling us toward humility when pride feels justified, toward forgiveness when resentment feels deserved, toward patience when anger feels powerful. At that moment, possession becomes irrelevant. What matters is whether we yield. Ignoring that voice does not remove the Spirit, it simply hardens the heart. Over time, resistance becomes habit, and habit becomes character. Many believers confuse spiritual comfort with spiritual health. They assume that because they feel assured, informed, or emotionally moved, they must be spiritually mature. Yet comfort often thrives where submission is absent. True submission disrupts. It challenges the stories we tell ourselves, confronts the masks we wear, and dismantles the illusion that we are in control. It asks us to lay down not only obvious sins but also respectable ones: self-reliance, quiet pride, and the need to always be right. Submission also requires trust. To yield control is to believe that divine wisdom surpasses personal understanding. This is difficult because human nature prefers predictability over faith. We would rather manage outcomes than obey without guarantees. Yet submission is not passive resignation, it is active alignment. It is choosing to act according to inner conviction even when it costs reputation, comfort, or certainty. It is living as though guidance is not merely helpful advice but rightful authority. Without submission, spiritual life becomes theoretical. Beliefs remain concepts rather than forces. Language replaces transformation. People learn how to speak about faith fluently while living largely unchanged. This creates an inner tension, knowing what is true but not living accordingly. Over time, this tension breeds frustration, guilt, or quiet cynicism. The issue is not a lack of spiritual resources, it is a refusal to release control. When submission is embraced, change becomes inevitable, not instant perfection but steady transformation. Decisions begin to reflect values rather than impulses. Reactions soften, courage grows, integrity strengthens. Life begins to align with belief not because of external pressure, but because internal authority has been acknowledged. The Spirit does not force obedience, it invites surrender. Possession without submission produces stagnation. Submission without perfection produces growth. The difference between a dormant faith and a living one is not how much one has received, but how much one has yielded. The question then is not whether the Spirit is present, but whether it is permitted to lead. The Spirit convicts, but we often silence it. Conviction is one of the most misunderstood and resisted aspects of spiritual life. Many believers say they desire growth, clarity, and closeness to God, yet feel uneasy when conviction actually arrives. This discomfort is not a sign of failure, it is evidence of life. Conviction is not condemnation meant to crush the soul, but illumination meant to correct direction. Still, instead of responding to it, we frequently learn how to quiet it. Conviction rarely comes as dramatic guilt or overwhelming emotion. More often, it arrives quietly. An inner unease after a careless word, a persistent nudge to make something right, a subtle warning before a selfish decision. It interrupts comfort rather than peace. Because it does not shout, it is easy to ignore. And because it challenges our behavior, it is tempting to rationalize it away. We tell ourselves we are tired, misunderstood, justified, or simply human. In doing so, we do not deny truth outright, we delay obedience. Silencing conviction is rarely intentional at first, it begins with postponement. Latter becomes the safest response. Later I will apologize. Later I will change. Later I will let go. Over time, later becomes never. Each ignored prompting weakens sensitivity, like repeatedly turning down the volume on a warning signal until it becomes background noise. The Spirit continues to speak, but the heart becomes practiced at not listening. One of the reasons conviction is resisted is because it exposes the gap between who we are and who we claim to be. It reveals inconsistency, and inconsistency threatens self-image. Many believers prefer to adjust their standards rather than confront their behavior. Instead of allowing conviction to transform them, they reshape their beliefs to protect their comfort. What once felt wrong is reclassified as normal. What once stirred the conscience is reframed as personal freedom. Another way conviction is silenced is through distraction. Noise fills the space where reflection should live. Business becomes a shield. Constant activity prevents stillness, and stillness is where conviction becomes clear. When life moves too fast, the inner voice struggles to be heard. This is not accidental. A hurried soul rarely has time to confront itself. Distraction offers relief without healing, escape without change. Conviction also threatens control. It calls for action, confession, reconciliation, restraint, courage. These actions often come with cost. Pride may have to bend. Reputation may be affected. Comfort may be lost. It is easier to suppress conviction than to pay the price obedience requires. Yet the cost of suppression is far greater. What is ignored internally eventually shapes behavior externally. Small compromises grow into patterns. Patterns harden into character. Many believers confuse conviction with negativity and assume that a spiritually healthy life should feel affirming at all times. This creates a dangerous imbalance. Conviction is not the enemy of joy, it is the pathway to it. Ignored conviction leads to restlessness, not freedom. The inner conflict it creates does not disappear, it goes underground, emerging as anxiety, irritability, or spiritual dryness. Peace cannot coexist with persistent resistance to truth. When conviction is embraced, it produces clarity rather than shame. It draws attention to what needs correction, not to condemn, but to restore alignment. Responding to conviction quickly keeps the heart tender. It prevents small issues from becoming deep fractures. It keeps spiritual life honest, not performative. The healthiest believers are not those who never feel conviction, but those who respond to it without delay. Silencing conviction does not remove responsibility, it only postpones growth. The Spirit does not force compliance, it respects the will even when the will resists. But every ignored prompting subtly shapes future choices, making obedience harder and resistance easier. Over time, this creates a faith that feels distant, not because the Spirit has withdrawn, but because attention has. To live by the Spirit requires courage to listen and humility to respond. Conviction is a gift that protects, redirects, and refines. When it is welcomed rather than silenced, spiritual life regains depth and authenticity. The question is not whether conviction will come, but whether it will be honored when it does. Power exists, but dependence is lacking. Many believers live as though spiritual power is an abstract idea rather than a present reality. They affirm its existence, speak about it confidently, and even admire it in others, yet rarely rely on it in daily life. The issue is not that power is unavailable, it is that self-reliance feels more familiar. Depending on inner strength, logic, experience, or control seems safer than leaning into unseen guidance, even when that guidance has proven faithful before. Dependence is difficult because it requires admitting limitation. Human nature resists this. We are taught to be capable, independent, and self-sufficient. Over time, these values quietly shape spiritual life as well. Prayer becomes a last resort instead of a first response. Decisions are made through analysis alone, with spiritual guidance invited only when uncertainty becomes overwhelming. In this way, power is acknowledged but rarely accessed. It remains untapped, not because it fails, but because it is not sought. Many believers substitute activity for dependence. They stay busy doing good things, serving faithfully and maintaining routines, assuming that effort equals effectiveness. But effort without dependence leads to exhaustion. When spiritual life is driven by willpower alone, it eventually produces burnout, frustration, or quiet resentment. Power was never meant to replace responsibility, but to sustain it. Without reliance on that power, even sincere devotion becomes heavy. Dependence also requires trust beyond understanding. Spiritual power does not always operate according to human logic or timing. It may lead toward patience instead of immediate resolution, silence instead of clear answers, or restraint instead of action. This can feel unsettling. Self-reliance offers the comfort of predictability, even when it fails. Dependence asks for faith when outcomes are unclear. For many, uncertainty feels riskier than struggle, so they choose control over reliance. Another reason dependence is lacking is familiarity. When spiritual language becomes common, its meaning can fade. Power becomes a concept rather than an experience. Believers learn how to talk about faith fluently without practicing reliance deeply. They know the words, the ideas, and the expectations, but not the posture of surrender. Dependence is not passive waiting. It is choosing to consult, seek, and yield before acting, not after plans collapse. Lack of dependence also shows in emotional responses. Anxiety, anger, and fear often reveal where trust is placed. When pressure rises, instincts take over. Worry replaces prayer, control replaces surrender. Reacting this way does not mean faith is absent. It means dependence has been interrupted. The heart defaults to what it trusts most. Relearning dependence requires intentional practice, not occasional crisis-driven appeals. True dependence reshapes perspective. It brings calm in uncertainty, patience in delay, and resilience in difficulty. It does not eliminate struggle, but it changes how struggle is carried. Life is no longer managed alone. Strength is drawn from a deeper source. Decisions become less frantic and more grounded. Confidence shifts from self-assurance to quiet trust. When dependence is restored, power becomes evident, not as spectacle, but as steadiness. Not as control, but as peace. The believer who depends does not appear stronger because they never struggle, but because they are not crushed by it. Power fulfills its purpose when it is relied upon, not merely acknowledged. The question is not whether power exists, but whether it is being trusted enough to shape how life is lived. Transformation requires surrender. Many believers desire change without yielding control, growth without discomfort, and renewal without disruption. This desire is understandable, but it misunderstands how true transformation works. Change at the surface level can be achieved through discipline, habit, or external pressure. Transformation, however, reaches deeper. It reshapes desires, motives, and identity. That kind of change cannot occur where control is tightly guarded. Surrender is often mistaken for weakness or passivity, but it is neither. It is an act of trust, not defeat. To surrender is to acknowledge that personal wisdom, effort, and intention have limits. It is to admit that some things cannot be fixed through willpower alone. This admission challenges pride, which is why surrender feels threatening. Control creates the illusion of safety, even when it fails to produce peace. Surrender removes that illusion and replaces it with dependence on guidance beyond the self. One of the greatest barriers to surrender is fear of loss. People worry about what they might be asked to give up: status, comfort, relationships, habits, or plans. They imagine surrender as subtraction rather than alignment. Yet surrender does not strip away what is good, it exposes what is false. It removes what cannot sustain life and replaces it with what can. The fear is real, but it is rooted in uncertainty, not truth. Transformation also requires surrender because it demands honesty. It brings hidden things into the light, motivations that are mixed, wounds that are unresolved, behaviors that are justified rather than healed. Without surrender, these things remain buried. They continue to influence decisions from beneath the surface. Surrender invites exposure, not for shame, but for healing. What is acknowledged can be changed, what is denied remains in control. Many believers attempt to negotiate surrender. They offer partial compliance, areas they are willing to change, behaviors they are ready to adjust while protecting others. This creates internal division. Life becomes fragmented, with faith influencing some choices but not others. Transformation cannot flourish in fragments, it requires coherence. Surrender unifies life by allowing one authority to guide all areas rather than competing loyalties pulling in different directions. Surrender is also ongoing, not a single moment. It must be renewed daily because the desire for control resurfaces easily. Circumstances change, pressures increase, and old habits return. Each day presents new opportunities to choose trust over self-direction. This repetition is not failure, it is formation. Over time, repeated surrender reshapes instincts. What once felt difficult becomes natural. What once required effort becomes identity. Without surrender, transformation is replaced by imitation. People learn how to look changed without being changed. Language improves, behavior adjusts, but the inner life remains largely untouched. This eventually leads to fatigue. because maintaining appearances requires constant effort. Surrender, by contrast, produces authenticity. Life aligns from the inside out, reducing the strain of pretending. When surrender is embraced, transformation unfolds gradually but deeply. Desires begin to shift. Reactions soften, old patterns lose their grip, not because discipline has improved, but because allegiance has changed. Control no longer sits at the center, trust does. This shift allows transformation to take root where effort alone never could. Transformation does not begin with trying harder. It begins with yielding more. Surrender opens the door that discipline cannot force open. Until control is released, change remains limited. But when surrender becomes the posture of the heart, transformation becomes not only possible, but inevitable. Faith becomes visible through obedience. Belief, when kept internal, remains invisible and largely indistinguishable from good intentions. It is obedience that gives belief a body. Many people sincerely hold faith as a private conviction, assuming that sincerity alone is enough. Yet faith that never moves beyond agreement never shapes reality. Obedience is the moment when belief steps out of theory and into action. Obedience reveals what faith truly trusts. Words can express devotion, but actions disclose allegiance. When obedience is costly, inconvenient, or misunderstood, it exposes whether belief is rooted in comfort or conviction. It is easy to agree with truth when it aligns with preference. Obedience tests faith when it demands restraint instead of indulgence, forgiveness instead of retaliation, integrity instead of advantage. In those moments, faith either becomes visible or retreats into silence. Many believers hesitate at obedience because they equate it with legalism or loss of freedom. They fear that obedience reduces faith to rule following. In reality, obedience is not about earning approval. It is about responding to trust. It flows from relationship, not obligation. When trust is present, obedience becomes an expression of love rather than a burden. Resistance often reveals not rebellion, but uncertainty about whether obedience will lead to good. Obedience also clarifies belief. Acting on faith strengthens it. When believers obey, they experience the consequences of alignment. Peace, clarity. When obedience is delayed, belief weakens. Doubt grows not always from lack of evidence, but from lack of action. Faith matures as it is practiced. Just as unused muscles weaken, unacted belief becomes fragile. Visible faith does not require dramatic gestures. Most obedience is quiet and ordinary. It appears in honest speech when dishonesty would be easier, in patience when irritation feels justified, in kindness when recognition is unlikely. These small acts shape character and influence others more deeply than public declarations. Obedience lived consistently builds credibility. People may question beliefs, but they notice integrity. Disobedience, even in small forms, gradually obscures faith. It creates dissonance between belief and behavior. Over time, this dissonance dulls sensitivity and weakens conviction. Faith becomes compartmentalized, something spoken about rather than lived. Obedience restores alignment. It brings belief and behavior back into harmony, making faith whole rather than fractured. Obedience also carries witness. A life shaped by faithful action stands out in a world driven by self-interest. It invites questions without demanding attention. It demonstrates that belief is not merely comforting but transformative. The credibility of faith is not measured by how passionately it is defended, but by how faithfully it is lived. When obedience becomes habitual, faith becomes unmistakable, not because it is loud, but because it is consistent, not because it seeks recognition, but because it produces fruit. Faith that is obeyed gains weight and substance. It becomes something others can see, experience, and trust. Faith does not need to be advertised to be known. It needs to be obeyed. When belief moves the will, guides choices, and shapes behavior, it steps into the light. Obedience is the bridge that carries faith from the heart into the world. The world notices lived faith, not claimed faith. Declarations of belief are common, but transformed lives are rare. People are surrounded by words, promises, and opinions, so language alone no longer carries weight. What captures attention is consistency between what is said and what is done. When faith remains a claim rather than a way of living, it blends into background noise. When it is embodied, it becomes difficult to ignore. Lived faith speaks through behavior long before it speaks through explanation. Patience in pressure, integrity under temptation, kindness without advantage, humility without display. These are not arguments, but evidence. They raise quiet questions in the minds of observers. People may resist doctrine, but they are drawn to authenticity. A life that reflects conviction invites curiosity because it feels rare and real. Claimed faith often relies on visibility, while lived faith relies on credibility. One seeks acknowledgement, the other earns trust. When belief is reduced to labels or statements, it becomes vulnerable to contradiction by behavior. The moment actions conflict with claims, credibility erodes. This erosion does not happen only in public failures, but in everyday inconsistencies. Small compromises, repeated often, weaken the message more than dramatic mistakes. Many believers underestimate how closely their lives are observed. Words may be forgotten, but patterns are remembered. The way someone handles disappointment, treats others, manages power, or responds to criticism communicates values more clearly than explanations ever could. Lived faith leaves an impression not because it is perfect, but because it is coherent. Even when flawed, it demonstrates direction and humility rather than denial. The world is not primarily looking for moral superiority, it is looking for hope that holds up under pressure. Claimed faith often collapses when circumstances are difficult, revealing that belief was more theoretical than trusted. Lived faith endures struggle without losing integrity. It does not pretend hardship away, it walks through it with steadiness. That endurance makes faith believable. Lived faith also resists performance. It does not need an audience. It is consistent in private and public, in recognition and obscurity. This consistency gives it weight. People sense when behavior is motivated by sincerity rather than image. Claimed faith often adjusts depending on who is watching. Lived faith remains the same because it answers to conviction, not approval. Influence flows naturally from lived faith. It does not demand agreement or pressure others to believe. It creates space for trust. People are more open to listening when they feel respected rather than persuaded. A life that reflects genuine belief lowers defenses. It shows that faith is not merely something to argue for, but something that sustains a person from within. When faith is lived, it becomes an invitation rather than a declaration. It says without words that belief has substance, resilience, and relevance. It proves that faith can shape character, not just opinions. The world may question claims endlessly, but it pays attention to lives that align with what they profess. In the end, faith does not need to announce itself to be known. It needs to be practiced. Lived faith leaves traces: peace in chaos, integrity in compromise, love in indifference. These traces linger, they speak when words fall short, and they are what the world remembers long after claims are forgotten. At the end of all this, the question is not whether we believe, but how we live. Having the Spirit is not the finish line, it is the starting point. The real measure of faith is not found in what we claim, but in what shapes our choices when no one is watching. The invitation before us is simple, but it is not easy. To stop merely possessing and start yielding, to stop silencing conviction and start responding, to stop relying on ourselves and start depending fully, to stop resisting surrender and allow true transformation, to let obedience make faith visible, and to live in a way the world cannot ignore. This is not a call to perfection, but to alignment, not to louder belief, but to deeper faithfulness. The Spirit was given not to decorate our faith, but to direct our lives. When we choose to live by that guidance, belief becomes life, truth becomes action, and faith becomes more than words, it becomes a witness. So let us leave this moment with courage to yield, humility to listen, and resolve to live what we profess, because the world does not need more people who say they believe. It needs people whose lives quietly prove it.